I wanted to thank specifically for the archival exhibition, the efforts of Martin Pierce and Deborah Hairston. Martin Pierce with the Journal Square Community Association researched, curated, and authored the exhibition. So there was a lot of effort and time that went into it, and we really hope you get a chance to look and take a deep dive into it. And a special thanks to Deborah Hairston for moderating this evening, and also helped greatly in curatorial efforts, editing the text, and revising some of the narratives. So it was a collaborative effort, and we would also like to thank those who worked with Martin to research the exhibition and loaning items that are on view in the other room. Neil Brunson of the Jersey City Afro-American Historical Society, Daisy DeCoster, the director of the Teresa and Edward Library of St. Peter's, and Mary Kinahan, yes, the St. Peter's University archivist. So quite a bit of effort and research went into it. And then for tonight, we have the distinguished panel, Deborah Hairston, an English professor at St. Peter's and involved in our city in a multitude of ways. When we assembled the panel, Deborah had already known everybody and and close relationships with extended family members and such. Muriel Roberts, Dee for some in the room, with the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society of the New Jersey chapter. Dr. John Johnson, an assistant professor of history at St. Peter's University, whose research centers on race, culture, class, and urban geography, and Daoud David Williams, the chairperson of the African Cultural Arts Festival and the founder of the Community Awareness Series.
Many years ago when Mayor Glenn Cunningham was alive, he searched through Jersey City and designated certain sites, or saw certain sites, and earmarked them. His work still carries on, and was something I looked at as part of my research in that effort. How much work did you derive from his project? Was called Hidden Footprints.
Well, a lot in terms of the history of the Underground Railroad, and in fact, Hidden Footprints should be better known and more seen. And it's one of our plans for the upcoming Bergen Square Day to have a monitor playing on a loop Hidden Footprints. So that throughout that whole day, people will have the opportunity to once again see hidden footprints and benefit from the late Glenn Cunningham's scholarship and love for the Afro-American past here.
As you know, the area at Journal Square was an early part of was the first settlement. That's where the old Bergen Church is located, and several other things that are very historic, including, as Mrs. Cunningham pointed out to me, Senator Cunningham, the whipping post was there at Journal Square. It came down the street, and they eventually Metropolitan settled in that area, the AME Zion Church. But it wasn't there originally. It was downtown on Monmouth Street. Was where it was founded, and it was then they had the next became very active in the downtown community before it moved uptown, and several other churches as well. And in fact, the photo of Mrs. Worthy, who was one of the co-founders of the Hudson Dance Troupe, was down on Monmouth Street, as you found out. And our pastor, one of our early pastors, was in the Civil War. Daoud, you've been very instrumental in documenting this information for almost 40 years in art, dance, and jazz music. You want to talk a little bit about your work?
Where do you start? Well, I grew up here in Jersey City. I grew up on Orient Avenue, and originally I'm from New York City, but we moved over here when I was 5 years old, and we moved to Orient Avenue, and one of the first kids I met was my next door neighbor, Glenn D. Cunningham. So me and Glenn grew up together, and I followed his career, I supported him, and so forth. And I'm glad you mentioned that about Glenn, because those projects that he did, the genealogy, footprints, all that, we were the ones that first premiered his projects, and that was at the Miller Branch Library in Jersey City, in which I worked. I'm still there, though I'm retired. It's now been 42 years I've been working with the library, and started in the Community Awareness Series, started in time-wise, 1977. and it grew out of a band I'm with, Spirit of Life Ensemble, which started in '75, still going strong. We're like 44 years now, going on 45, and we're one of the groups that have endured, even as a big band, over the years, and we've played in many, many different places here in the U.S., Canada, and out of the country and throughout Europe and so forth. And, just, giving us a good background in terms of the arts and the artists that are here. And matter of fact, we just did a music project. It was called the Jersey Bounce, and we hosted it at Miller Branch Library. Some of you might have been there, and it was covering the history of jazz music in Jersey City from the 1960s and 70s. And we had a panel discussion that also featured Mary Aiken, one of the Jersey City's legendary artists, and along with Brian Benahoove, who is director of the Jersey City Jazz Festival, as well as the Riverview Jazz. So we collaborated with him and had this wonderful historical piece where we had photo exhibits and literature. We also had the band play music from that period, and had a list of musicians we did up in our research. I brought some of it here. Musicians that came out of Jersey City, musicians that came through Jersey City during that period. And these are musicians that I personally knew as well, and living here like over 7 decades. And some of them were like Bill Cody. I don't know if you know him, George Red Walcott. I'm sure you all know Kool and the Gang. Spirit of Life Ensemble. We had Cliff Walston, Mary Aiken, Ted Curson, Jimmy Tyler, who was like actually a legend during that period because he was probably one of the most developed and advanced jazz musicians in Jersey City and in the Black community. And he was like Jersey City's own Charlie Parker and that. So we had a whole list of people like Roy Hamilton, and that the vocalists, and Barbara Sharp, which some of us know, Freddie Roach, and you could go on, and that in terms of musicians that were active during that period, and these are some, really great artists that lend to the culture of Jersey City. So we're carrying on that tradition at the Miller Branch Library and elsewhere through the Community Awareness Series, through the Spirit of Life Ensemble, and we're marching on. And we do a host of other things too, like the Martin Luther King tribute. Matter of fact, we got the oldest, longest running Martin Luther King tribute in Jersey City and Hudson County. We just celebrated our Kwanzaa event at Miller Branch, which also is the oldest and longest Kwanzaa event in Hudson County. Mm-hmm. So we've been in the forefront of a lot of this activity for many years.
Well noted. You were featured in Metropolitan's commemoration of Martin Luther King Jr. And I remember one of my early visits to Miller Branch was when you had Ruby Dee there. I still have her autograph for my son. Before I go to John, I wanted to touch base with Dee Dee Roberts. She's also native to Jersey City.
Good evening. Yes, I'm 4th generation in Jersey City. My great-grandparents arrived in 1890 from Massachusetts, and my great-grandfather, Hudson Jones Oliver, I call him my Renaissance man. He was a court stenographer in the New York courts. He was the executive secretary to the president of the Prosser Steel Company which was a Wall Street firm. In his spare time, he purchased land. Some of it was from the parcels of the Sipp family when they were breaking up, Sipp Avenue. So the Sipp family had huge parcels of land, and when it was divided up, he was one of the people who purchased some of that land. And in doing so, he would build houses in his spare time on Sipp Avenue, and he bought a home or built a home on Corbin Avenue. And then there were other parts of the city on Kearney Avenue. He liked the number 29 for some reason. I don't know why. But he would number his houses 29, but then they would tell him, oh no, you can't have it there. So like 29 Corbin was changed to 35 Corbin. And I love the stories, and it brings home to me so much of the city and all over. They were in the Marion section. They were in the Junction, the section of Communipaw and Grand Street. They were on Prescott at one time. They came from Massachusetts in 1885 to New York City. And they had 3 children before coming to Jersey City. One of those children, of course, was my grandmother, Gladys Washington Oliver, and that is her 8th grade diploma from PS 23, and the superintendent who signed it was Henry Snyder, for which Henry Snyder High School is named. So these connections I attended. My mother attended Snyder. I attended Snyder. My brothers. Finding Henry Snyder signed on the diploma of my grandmother just really kind of blew me away. Their son, Dr. Hudson Jones Oliver, who was born in New York City but raised in Jersey City on Corbin Avenue, became a doctor. He attended Howard University. He was also one of the World War I black doctors that were brought together. There were 104 volunteer doctors, and his bio is in this book. I'm very proud of his accomplishments. But aside from being a physician and opening a practice on Stuyvesant Row in Harlem, he was the number 1 African-American basketball player of his era. He was known, if you look up the Black Fives, they call them, you'll see his bio as the top basketball player of his day. And his granddaughters would say, but Doc was so short, how could he have been the top basketball player? Well, things were a bit different in 1905, okay? But these are some of what I have found interesting about my family, and have given me such a sense of their accomplishments, and that I was always taught by my mom that you can do whatever you set your mind to.
My wife gave me permission to come out tonight, so glad to be here. Good evening, everyone. Glad to be here. It's sad to say that I don't have any roots in Jersey City except for St. Peter's, and so I can't share any stories about my history with Jersey City. But my family migrated to a city right across the river in Newark 50 some odd years ago. Before I get into, I guess, my experience and my understanding of African American history, I do want to touch on the importance of history and the power of it. And I'm glad to see so many people here today to hear some of these stories. because in essence, history is the truth, right? These are the stories, the fables, the substances upon which so much of who we are is built upon. And in this present day, where the truth is so elusive, and where so many of us are told who we can be and what we are without any clear understanding of our circumstances and how we got from point A to point B, I think so many of these stories are important. And it's amazing how we can share them and pass them on. In a lot of ways, it's explicit, so we can come to these kinds of programs, but in a lot of ways, things are very much implicit, right? And so the fact that you're named after your mother, you know, that's how history can be passed down. I'm John Johnson Jr., right? My full name is actually John Wesley Johnson Jr. My father was raised in a Methodist church in South Carolina. And so by bearing his name, of course, I am heir to his legacy. But truth be told, his dad actually, I should have been the third, but his father had to change his name because of some peculiar circumstances, which I can't get into now. But again, that's part of the long story about why my father ended up being raised by his grandfather, and then eventually moving up to New Jersey. History can be passed down through music, you know, through the arts, either through lyrical content, through the lessons that are passed from one musician to another, from recordings, right? There's so much that can be tapped from those sources to help us better understand what was going on in Jersey City in 1962, right? And the stories surrounding who was in a room cutting heads at any point in time. Churches are great sources of history. You have your church elders there who invariably will love to talk and share stories and tell the young folks, you know, what's going on or what was going on in their day. Whether, you know, the church burnt its mortgage and the fact that it became a property owner, like the church has its own edifice. One of the things that we can note, and Isabel Wilkerson talks about this, is that churches often become places where people from certain parts of the country migrated to. And so you can go to one particular church and everybody in there probably came from South Carolina, right? You go to another church and everybody there came from North Carolina because people kind of just tracked into one particular place. And therein you can find history. And so I think it's important for us that, you know, when we leave these places is to look for those sources, because Jersey City is in an interesting space and Newark is facing this as well, right? As we are progressing and facing all kinds of environmental challenges, the fact is urban centers are becoming ever more important now. People fled in the 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s, but now they're coming back. And with that comes displacement. Neighborhoods are changing. And with that comes the loss of memory, cultural memory, historical memory. And that can be bad, particularly for young kids. I'm very aware of the fact that, unfortunately, our elders are passing on. And with those storytellers, we lose so much. And kids can grow up in neighborhoods not understanding the wealth that they actually have around them. And so I think it's really incumbent upon us to kind of continue these things in these formal spaces, but also in informal spaces. So much of what we learn about history just kind of happens, you know. A little bit about my story and my work. I'm researching the history of the Weequahic section. Anybody that knows Philip Roth? Philip Roth grew up in the Weequahic section. It was a majority Jewish neighborhood. But by the late 50s, going into the 60s, it became majority black. And it just so happened that my family, when they came from South Carolina, they settled in Weequahic. And if you listen to the stories, everyone says, oh, Weequahic was great back in the day. 67 came, the riots occurred, and then everything went to pits. And I was faced with a question. Well, my mother came up in 69 after she graduated from high school. She was here during 67. She was babysitting for her brother and sister. And so a young country girl from South Carolina is told that she has to sleep on the floor because bullets might be flying through the house. It's a little disconcerting. And somehow or another, she decided that she wanted to come to New Jersey after all of that, right? But as I was saying, in 69, my mother came up here. And so this was after 67. Was Weequahic that bad? My first 4 years, I remember vividly growing up in that neighborhood. Going to Weequahic Park, visiting my neighbors across the street. I ran out of the house one time, almost got hit by a car. That's a whole nother story. But I have vivid memories of this place, and they weren't all that bad. And so I went back and looked into the archives and realized that there were some significant changes, but Weequahic was actually a solid middle-class Black community. If you were anybody, you wanted to live in the Weequahic section, even post 67. And so for me, it was revelatory because my lineage, my history isn't steeped in some notion of, these pathological people who don't know how to take care of community and they're criminals and they're intellectually incapable of doing anything worthwhile. It forced me to think about how neighborhoods change and how that can actually affect communities and affect children and people that live in those communities. And so my work is really about retelling the story of the Weequahic section. And I think in a lot of ways that's what we are doing here. We're retelling the story of Jersey City, because if you go down King Boulevard, you get this understanding of what's happening now. But what was going on 15 and 30 and 40 and 50 years ago? One thing I want to research here in Jersey City is the history of I believe it's the 64 rebellion, and what happened at that moment and what led to that. Because so much is said, well, these young thugs are coming in and they don't know how to take care of the community. Well, what was going on for people to be angry in the first place? And is this similar to the stories in Newark, where people were living in squalid conditions, where they were being charged 3 times the rent that their predecessors were being charged? That the kids were going to schools with teachers who really didn't like Black kids. They were going on half-day schedules where they only got 4 hours of schooling, where the compatriots in the suburbs were getting 6 and 7 hours of schooling. What were the contrasts and differences, and what was the municipality doing to take care of those people? Those are some of the questions that we really need to get at to understand how certain communities in Jersey City have gotten to the point where they are now, where people can move in at dirt cheap and then eventually the rent goes up, and the folks that have held on and maintained it for so long are forced to leave. I think that's the power of what history can do for us. And so I think I'll close my remarks there because there's a lot more I could say, but I'll stop there.
You knew Clement Price, right?
Yes.
And you worked with him.
Mm-hmm.
Very well.
Yeah, my
You worked with the 50 Project.
yeah, my advisor on my dissertation was Dr. Clement Alexander Price. He was a noted historian. He was the historian of Newark, and unfortunately passed away in 2014. But was one of those individuals that was really invested in community. He wrote one of the earlier histories to retell the story of Black Newark in a way that I don't want to say retold the story in the same vein as we think of the Irish and the Jews, but in essence, he showed the humanity of Black folks and showed why, how the community changed around them. Because in so many ways, I mean, people migrate because they want opportunities, they want to seek something, not because they want to tear up a neighborhood. And so what did they encounter when they got here? And essentially what they found was, especially with the election of Hugh Adenizio, a person that could really care less about his constituents as much as maintaining his own power. And I think it's safe to say we saw the same thing in Jersey City. We've seen it in Baltimore. We've seen it invariably in the places where Black people have migrated to. And so Clem was instrumental in helping guide me through my work. It was through him that I ended up working on the Newark 350 project, which was the celebration of Newark's 350th anniversary. 2016 was the city's anniversary. And through that, we essentially engaged the community to tell the history of Newark. Rather than it being a top-down approach, it was a grassroots-up approach. And so we had community members submit proposals, and they told their own stories in these interesting ways. We had concerts, we had poetry readings, we had church services. We even had a funeral home come up with a mock play to basically tell the story of her family's history in the funeral home, Churchman Funeral Home. I mean, it was amazing. And so these were just some of the things that we used to tell the story of the city. So.
That's good. Well, I have a similar experience. I grew up in the Amy Zion Church, at Metropolitan Amy Zion, and here in Jersey City. And we got there actually by happenstance. We were on our way somewhere else. I just happened to notice a wedding and stopped because I wanted to look at the wedding. My husband was not interested at all because we had just gotten married. And so, but next thing you know, he calls me and says, I want to see inside this house. And we end up buying that house about a week later. Yeah, 1 week. we had to show our marriage license in order to buy that, and we were redlined as well in order to buy the house. But we still live there, and Jersey City has been good to us. We, both of my kids have finished college. My son works in California at Facebook, and my daughter, as Dee Dee said in her troop, she went to became a doctor. She's finishing up her residency now and will be attending on a postdoc fellowship at Columbia starting in July. So the city has been good. They went to McNair here in Jersey City, and so I love this city. I mean, where else could they get that kind of education for free? And now that the school board is under fire, and again, I guess the mayor now wants to take that over. But at Metropolitan, though, it used to amaze me to just live in a neighborhood across the street from Metropolitan and see, which is down here on Bergen Avenue, see that there's so much history right here in the neighborhood. It was famous during, I guess it gained some notoriety during the Civil War. One of the former pastors, Eli Biddle, was a veteran of the Civil War. He went to Yale, earned his BS degree or BA, and was the president, was the pastor of Metropolitan when it became, joined the New Jersey Conference. It was actually founded, though, by free blacks in the 1846. So this year we're celebrating our 174th anniversary. And many people don't realize that there were free black people in Jersey City before the end of slavery. And people always tell me that. They always say, "Oh, I didn't know that there were people like that." Where they lived, the woman who started Metropolitan lived out on Mama Street. She invited the pastor into her home. They were in the New York Conference at that time, and she invited, I think, some family, the Manning family, which is still in existence, was involved, and some other families. I don't remember all of their names, but the Parker family was very instrumental. Cornelius Parker had a funeral home, and they've already written the story of Metropolitan, basically, as they say. And I think there's a story that I once read by Doris Jean Austin, and when she characterizes the story, she's talking about Parker Funeral Home. She calls it by another name. I can't remember the name, but she talks about having an experience in church. She's actually, I think, at Salem Baptist Church, talking about, going to about Mr. Parker. So, there's so many experiences like that. That I just wonder, why don't we talk about that? People will say, "Oh, I didn't know Martin Luther King ever came to Metropolitan." Well, yes, he did. He also received an honorary degree from St. Peter's College after he won the Nobel Peace Prize, and churches, organizations were clamoring to get his attention. And so we have a rich history that our children don't know about, and we need to preserve that. We also need to preserve the Underground Railroad building, the last standing station on Underground Railroad, which is off of Clifton Place.
Yeah, if I could mention something. A number of the people that were mentioned here, whether it was name them, I've met them in my lifetime, and I've had working relationships with them. I've mentioned Glenn Cunningham earlier, but so many, Ray Brown, Ted Brunson, who started the African American Museum, Captain Taylor, who was the first head of the fire department, black fire chief. A lot of the firsts I've met, over the years. And one of the things I want to mention too is that in growing up here in Jersey City, we moved here in the late 40s. And I'll never forget, in 1949, I remember seeing a trolley car go down Jackson Avenue. And I think it was like right after that year, they took the tracks out, and that was the end of the trolley experience. But I remember seeing the trolley go down Jackson. So where I lived on Orient was very close to Jackson Avenue, which is really your kind of shopping mall. Today's mall would be compared to that, because you had every store you could imagine along Jackson Avenue, as well as Monticello. And we had on Jackson Avenue several theaters as well as Ocean Avenue and so forth. And I spent a lot of time in the movie houses because it only cost 10 cents to get in, and you saw about 3 movies and the cartoons and a host of other things. And that, so me and Glenn spent a lot of times in the movie house. But the way Jersey City was made up ethnically, and that I lived on Orient, and Orient Avenue at that time growing up, and I'm talking about late 40s, 50s, early 60s, was like the United Nations. You had about every ethnic group living on Orient. But if you go to Claremont, which is 1 block over south, from Claremont Avenue all the way to the Bayonne line was 99% white. In that. If you go from Kearney Avenue, which is 1 block over going north from Kearney all the way to Monticello, was predominantly black. That's how the city was divided at that time. I mean, really along racial lines. And the thing is that we lived on the United Nations block, and we were able to check out different cultures and different religions and so on and so forth. So it really kind of helped in expanding our knowledge as far as how other people live and so forth. And, you know, it was interesting. And I'd never forget one day we're talking and Glenn said, you know, we had a great experience growing up on Orient because of that. Also, one of the enjoyments was going horseback riding, which there used to be stables down by close to, well, this was for the people, not for the cops.
Oh, okay.
I remember the cops stable, but right near the Bayonne borderline, Jersey, there were stables, and you could go horseback riding for about $5. And we used to go there, get on a horse, and if you wanted a guide, you could go out in the streets and you could ride down your block on a horse. And we used to do that, you know. But, you know, it was really fun growing up in spite of the conditions that we later found out, because we were protected very much during that time. And the first thing I remember in terms of protests was remember the Woolworths boycotts and that, the lunch counter boycotts? We had a Woolworth on Jackson and Claremont. And I remember walking by there because I went to 29 school and I saw all these picketers out there, you know, and don't shop here, don't eat here, all that. And that was the first time I saw a protest movement and that, and it stuck in my head from that point on. And then later I got into the background, why this was taking place and so on and so forth. And you know, various experiences brought me to the point where, you know, I was serious activist during the 60s, 70s, still an activist and that on many issues and so forth. One of them fighting for the library and that, and many others. And the African American Museum, there wouldn't have been one at the Greenville, which is now the Earl Morgan Library. We fought to establish that library because the board voted it down. We went to every board meeting and raised that as an issue till finally we start winning some people over. And the 2 people we won over was Dr. Catherine Gaines and Ali Culbreth. They were on the board and they started listening to us and said, hold up. How come there can't be a museum on the 2nd floor? It was vacant. Nobody was using it. And Ted Brunson was able to establish the museum from that point. And of course, Glenn got involved in part of the genealogy group and so forth. But there's a lot of issues and that I know in my lifetime that I've taken on, and I mean both local, national, international, you name it, fighting for Earl Morgan, the library to be named after Earl Morgan. We spearheaded that and that. So you have a black reporter who was very instrumental in educating the community on the Black community through the
He was
Jersey
the
Journal.
reporter.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, a great writer, and we got and a lover of the books and the library, and we got the library named after him. I also was part of spearheading the naming of PS 34 after Barack Obama.
I think for us here, we kind of take it for granted. Oh yeah, there was slavery in Jersey City. There were slave owners. There were enslaved Africans here. We kind of just take it for granted because we know. But I think for the larger public, the general understanding is that slavery was an institution that was confined to the South. And all they did was pick cotton, maybe rice and tobacco. And the people that did the work were not skilled laborers. But with the history tells us that New Jersey was a major slaveholding state, partly because New York City was at the time when the English took it from the Dutch, they were trying to make it the Charleston of the North. And so it was a major slave importation space. And then Jersey City, just being across the water, became a major entry point for slave owners. The fact that in New Jersey, individuals were granted, I believe it was 150 acres per head. And so if they had enslaved peoples, that means that they would have more land. And that was really key for people. We forget that we had a lot of Barbadians that came to New Jersey and settled because they had owned slaves. And so that gave them significant amounts of land. I think it's important to tell that story, one, because it helps us reimagine and rethink our state, right? Two, it forces us to rethink, who were these people that were enslaved? Because again, we often think of them as these brutes who lacked any kind of skilled labor, but these were people that were blacksmiths, wood carvers, they made soap. The women that came over, and even some of the men, they were herbologists. And so they were very key. They were very skilled laborers. A lot of them worked in the early factories that eventually became these massive factories. And so industrialization in New Jersey could not have happened unless there were enslaved people. Eventually, the free laborers that came from, and free in quotes, that came from Ireland eventually supplanted them. But by and large, if it was not for this particular labor source, the development of New Jersey would be a lot different. Add to that the fact that slavery did not end in New Jersey until the Civil War because of gradual manumission, and that forces us to really rethink race relations writ large. We think of the North as being this, bastion of liberty, and they fought against the South, but it was a lot more complicated than that. Right. And those burial grounds, I think, in a lot of ways helps us rethink. Oh, there were enslaved people buried there. How is that possible? Right. And so I think your work is vitally important to telling the story and creating a landmark that people cannot just walk by. And so when we're dead and gone, that will still be there. And it will force people to ask those hard questions.
I used to work for the Jersey Central Railroad. I was a brakeman, but my father retired from the railroad. He was an inspector, but he did many things. He was involved in so much. He was also a Ward F political leader, and that's where part of my activism comes from, because I remember in our kitchen, there'd be all these Black men in the kitchen, the brothers, and talking with my father, and a lot of them went on to become the first of this, the first of that, and we're talking about people like Fred Martin and first Black superintendent of schools, Franklin Williams. All these people were in my house, and I'm just a kid watching them and listening and trying to understand what they were talking about. But my father, besides being a political activist, and that also talk about first, he was the first African American to be appointed to the incinerator authority here in Jersey City. He was the first African American to sit on the welfare board. He was the first African American who was on the city and county real estate board. And also he was a Ward F a political leader, and he was an entrepreneur as well. So he did many, many things. He was very active, and I think part of that has rubbed off in that. So anyway, I'm very proud of the contributions my father made, and he helped to integrate the workforce on Jersey Central Railroad, because at that time you had only the Pullman porters and you had mechanics helper. That's the only jobs that black people could get. Mechanics helper, and that you're not even considered a master mechanic, or even though you're working with the mechanic, but your title was mechanics helper. He organized the union and took this to the courts, and they struck this discrimination down, and then the jobs start opening up. My brother retired from Central Railroad as an engineer. So thanks to my father and others that took up that cause and that. So I want to just say that.
Well, for everybody, I really appreciate you coming out tonight. Martin, Daoud, John, Dee Dee. Hopefully we can continue these sessions in another place, a larger forum. It's been wonderful, truly, truly wonderful. Thank you so much.